Welcome, everybody. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties that we're trying to clear up, but we will try to get started. So yes, welcome to our launch webinar for the policy brief, Global Citizens Assemblies, Pathways for the UN, Principles, Design and Implementation. We have a very full lineup for you today. So I just want to welcome you on behalf of Democracy International and Democracy Without Borders, the co-publishers of this paper, and I will hand it off to Nudhara Yusuf of the Coalition for the UN We Need, who will be our moderator this afternoon. Thank you, Nudhara.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for the introduction, and we will get right to it because, as you said, a packed agenda. Just to maybe provide a little bit of a briefing opening here. I think we are all aware, all those who are joining this call are aware that we're in a very particular global moment. And now more than ever, we the peoples need to be speaking up on behalf of the United Nations, on behalf of multilateralism. It's in that vein that Coalition for the UN We Need was very proud to produce the People's Pact for the Future back last year ahead of the Summit of the Future, where governments negotiated a pact for the future, which is a visioning document more than anything else, of 56 actions towards a better, more functional, multilateral and global system. In the People's Pact for the Future that was produced, we were proud that a Global Citizens Assembly was a key recommendation put forward after many consultations with thousands of participants around the world who really indicated the need for such a participatory forum for global governance. So I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar where we will dive deeper into the paper on Global Citizens Assemblies, Pathways for the UN, Principles, Design and Implementation. We'll start by hearing from 4 authors of the report. We'll then go into a panel with some discussants who will provide their feedback, their thoughts, and some additional context. We hope there will be some time for Q&A at the end, but do continue to add some thoughts into the chat box as we proceed through this webinar. I will also say we will have a Portuguese speaker on this webinar, so if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will be able to click into the English channel so that you can be sure to follow along regardless of language. Not as a barrier, but as a more inclusive part of what we're doing today. So in that vein, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker who will provide some framing context for this webinar, but also did for the report in writing the foreword of the report, former Mayor of Francisco Morato in Brazil, São Paulo, Renata Sene, who has been a strong advocate, not just in this work, but in practice of participatory governance through several plans that they've conducted in their city. So Renata, I'm delighted to introduce you today for a brief introduction. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Bom dia a todos e a todas. É com alegria participar desse seminário.
Good morning to everybody.
Tema que considero essencial.
It's very happy to participate to this webinar.
Gostaria de compartilhar pouco da nossa jornada para dar visibilidade.
Spotlight.
Agradecer muito essa acolhida em relação à minha língua oficial.
I would like to share what we've done. We had a remarkable experience at Francisco Morato.
Então, eu sou uma cidadã moratense, brasileira.
I am a citizen from Francisco Morato. I'm from São Paulo. I am a social assistant. My first term was in 2016. With almost 30% of the valid votes. It was a journey as a female, and the female participation in the politics, very important.
Da população na construção
we did a model that we are sure that the population would participate.
Do combinado dessa escuta cuidadosa e fui reeleita então com 97% dos votos da cidade na minha reeleição.
term with
E hoje
more than 80% of the valid
tem
votes.
como princípio a política, a educação.
And today I preside a foundation
Mas essa trajetória
that focuses on the citizen, education, and the citizens' well-being.
Da onde eu sou, posicionada no mundo, no Brasil, no estado de São Paulo,
She's from the world, Brazil, state of São Paulo, in the
uma
metropolitan
cidade com
region.
indicadores sensíveis que acolhe todo o Brasil em busca de oferta de mão de obra e de
It
acolhida em
has
seu
sensible
território.
indicators.
Isso trouxe para a cidade um sentimento
It brought to the
que
city
precisava ser resgatado
a
de
feeling
pertencimento.
that needed
Que o poder
to
público até
belong.
então não tinha transparência com a população sobre os seus
The
atos, nós
public
convocamos essa
government
população
didn't
para a
have
sessão.
a
Demos
bridge
nome,
with the citizens
chamamos,
yet.
convocamos, fizemos
So
convite aos sábados, aos domingos, aos
we did
domingos,
some
para garantir a
callings,
participação de fato da população. E demos
and
nome,
we
Francisco
guaranteed
Morato,
that
audiência
everybody
direta.
participated. We
Assim
called
feito,
them
começou uma
up.
audiência pequena, com 100 e poucas pessoas, mas
We did a
depois
small
a população
audience.
sentiu que era de verdade e veio criança, mulheres, jovens, idosos participar da assembleia que não tinham onde sentar. Feito isso,
So we had a lot of people come in. We didn't really have anywhere that they could sit. So many people that we have participating on this. And on our next multi-year plan, we had even more people.
Gestão, saúde, cultura.
As this is an overview from the two PPAs that we did. So we had more than 60,000 people participating on this.
O nosso governo fez sucessão através do novo prefeito Ido Guzmão e a gente agora faz o PPA Kids.
So we have continuity on the work for the 2025, but now we are hearing kids, so it's PPA Kids.
Fundamental no planejamento da cidade é um plano master, o plano maior, que é o plano diretor da cidade, que a gente também convoca a população para participação, e não só isso, a gente quis garantir por lei a participação de muitas vozes, criando 25 conselhos municipais, com direito à voz, à deliberação, à mensagem e à construção desse plano maior. Feito isso, a gente conseguiu trazer para Francisco Morato, Delibera, a implementação da Assembleia Cidadã, o que nos trouxe ainda mais envergadura, vocação para trazer a população para o centro do debate. E esse processo acabou nos ensinando ainda
We brought the
mais.
Citizens Assembly to Francisco
Precisava de
Morato,
uma mesa com muitas
and
vozes,
we
todos os
needed a
territórios da
table
cidade,
with many voices, with all the territories of the city.
diferenciada do seu
So
ponto de
we
vista, do
convocated
bairro,
all
da
the
rua.
citizens. We
Esse
sent
processo foi
out
financiado.
invitations.
O que a gente percebeu que é fundamental para garantir a participação das pessoas em
And
todos esses processos.
we did some random selections, and then with all of them, we got about 2,000 invitations out, and we got 30 out of these 2,000 letters that accepted. And our response was very big about all these invitations. So here we have all the identified people that, the inclusion that we had on this process. So we had this with many different people. We had inclusion, you can see on the prior slide that we have the percentages.
Para esse público tão importante. Então a gente cria documento.
Until today, this public, women, and elderly people, and we reached many different people, and then we also reached kids. Now we are working with kids too. It's a continuation. So if we could hear all the citizens, now including the kids, we have a different overview of the needs of the population. So I think what in Morato was done, I think we can do it broadly, we can do it over the world. And this caught us attention for the people's participation, how they know what they're doing, and they are the ones that know.
Mas virou instrumento de política pública e nós tivemos documentário
so this is a public
no Global
policy instrument.
Nossa jornada. Então, isso mostrou que a nossa
that
população
showed that our population has a lot to say. The territory is very important, that we can qualify listening to the citizens, that the government could be closer to the population. This is our main goal. And we had a great process, so we don't forget anybody, we don't leave anybody behind, and so we can include everybody.
Da minha voz nessa
I want to thank you a lot for hearing me, for having this space, so I can have this space to speak on this democratic process, and that Brazil will need to, we hope that Brazil will develop more and more on this democracy and hearing the citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Renata, for sharing your story with us and this real case study of walking the walk, you know, not just talking the talk. We did this, it's possible, it's feasible. And I love this idea of it's not just about having a seat at the table, it's about creating more tables, right? And having more of those spaces to have those discussions, to really decrease the distance between your polity and your politics. Right. So thank you so much for sharing that case study with us and the example that you set in your work. It's now my pleasure to bring on the next segment of this webinar and discussion, to introduce the authors of the report that have really kind of looked at the technical lessons learned. You know, we've seen positive case studies, but what makes this successful? So in that respect, I'm delighted to introduce Tim Murthy from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Nicole Curato, now with the University of Birmingham, Caroline Vernon, Global Lead Advocacy and Campaigns at Democracy International, and Andreas Bummel, Executive Director of Democracy Without Borders. I see them slowly joining the spotlight on the screen, but Tim, I'd like to kick off with you. Could you speak a little bit to the general rationale of why citizen input and participation is needed in global governance?
Thank you so much, Nudhara, and hello, colleagues. And let me start by thanking Democracy Without Borders, Democracy International, for convening this webinar, Andreas and Caroline and team, and also for giving this opportunity to share some thoughts. Yes, on the rationale of why citizen input and participation is needed in global governance, I think it's now pertinently clear that we are facing a major political crisis, or some say multiple crises, and the post-World War II order has come to an end. As Antonio Gramsci, advised us, the crisis always consists of the fact that the old is dying, the new cannot be born, and in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms begin to appear. So we are very much in the Gramscian interregnum. If you don't know what a Gramscian interregnum looks like, we're in it. And the choice before us, I think, is to capitulate to the forces of global authoritarianism, or to forge forward with the new agenda, the emergence and the ultimate consolidation, I would argue, of a global democratic order. We have to go back to ancient Greece to touch on this and unpack this word demos, the national demos, citizens who then had kratos, the ability to rule or manage their affairs. The question is can we identify the basic elements of a global demos, global democratic framework, a worldwide collective that could actually then lay the foundation? And what are the pathways for people to exercise democratic worlds and the interconnected world that we're in right now? The question more specifically is whether we are in a global constitutive moment, given the end of the post-World War II order, where the rule makers of yesterday have become the rule makers of today. And we see the global South emerging as champions of the international system of laws that have been trying to regulate the global order, whereas the authors of the post-World War II liberal international order seem to be in a state of disorientation and loss. So going forward, I think the crisis that we are in, it's very clear that humanity has to make a decision how to move forward. We don't necessarily have the geopolitical vocabulary in our international relations lexicon to describe what might come. But it would seem to me that given the fact that the global decision making has primarily been structured by governments, nation states, there is a very strong case, and I think a constitutive moment prevails now to bring the people in. The Westphalian order, I think, is really descending into irrelevancy, hastened by the ruins of the illiberal democratic order. So the people then must come forth, and it's not a new idea. The Greek Stoics 2,000 years ago, some declared themselves as the citizens of the world, cosmopolites. And we're at that moment now where I think every human being has to be granted the equal right to participate in open dialogue, to reconfigure their own society. So global citizen assemblies, then I think it's very clear. There's a very strong and compelling case for global citizen assemblies, which would create inclusive, reflective, open-minded, informed decision-making platforms. The United Nations itself, summarized in its UN 75 report, that the people around the world do perceive the UN to be too far away from their daily lives, and agrees that direct participation mechanisms would be a potential path to alleviate this. And so GCAs offer a very compelling case for global citizens to influence international decisions and the future of multilateralism. Furthermore, GCAs can also educate participants and the public at large and help strengthen global connectedness, global citizenship, which will contribute towards hopefully global constitution making as a primary project over the next 5 to 10 years. More specifically, given the global democratic deficit and the global governance vacuum, a very deliberate campaign to invoke Article 109 in the General Assembly of the United Nations to convene a general conference to renew the UN Charter, which would then help us to begin to frame the outlines of what a global democratic order might look like going forward. Thank you, Nudhara.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that concise, both philosophically contextualized, but also very practical inputs and thoughts. I'd like to now bring in Nicole Carato from the University of Birmingham to explain some of the key elements of citizens' assemblies in general, and potentially some good examples to draw on at the national level. So, Nicole, over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So I've been researching citizens' assemblies for more than a decade now, and I position myself as a critical scholar in the field. So that means I believe in the potential of these forums to transform how we do politics and take advantage of the Gramscian interregnum that Tim mentioned, especially at the global scale. But as a critical scholar, I'm also attuned to the tensions and risks that they bring. So that's why I really cherish spaces like this, where we can critically reflect on the role of citizens' assemblies, be clear-headed about their limitations, and imagine together how they might be adapted and scaled to meet the challenges of our time. So what are citizens' assemblies? At their core, they're built on the principle of deliberative democracy, that everyday people should be directly involved in shaping the laws that govern their lives. And what makes citizens' assemblies unique compared to other forms of citizen participation are three design features. So first, people involved in the citizens' assembly are chosen by civic lottery or sortition. So we use the principles of stratified random selection so that the people taking part in the assembly look like the microcosm of the wider society. So in the world's first global assembly, for example, they describe the participants as a snapshot of the human family. So why do we do this? We do this because some people argue that sortition gives us a statistical representativeness of the population, just like in polling, and we can draw inferences from that statistical representation. But the field, academic literature and practice, is actually having a debate about sortition. Others say that you don't really need statistical representativeness. Diversity is important. Some say that the principle of random selection is that everyone should have an equal chance of being selected, right? Like one person, one lottery ticket. But others argue that actually, no, those who are most affected by the issue should have a greater weight in the draw. So I raised this just to say that there is no consensus on this topic. This debate goes at the very heart of what fairness and legitimacy means in sortition. And so it's good to have this discussion as well as to what kind of recruitment is the most adequate for the demands of global governance. But the principle of random selection remains as its distinguishing feature. The second feature is that these assemblies prioritize informed deliberation. So participants don't just show up and have their say. They hear from experts, stakeholders, they listen to one another. Citizens' assemblies are actually a long form of deliberation. These processes takes time, weekends, days, weeks even. And while there are many debates in the field, I think one of the least contentious points about citizens' assemblies is citizen competence. The evidence is clear that when provided with time, information, and space to deliberate, everyday citizens can be thoughtful, open-minded, and competent decision makers. And I've seen this firsthand, everyday Australians deliberating on complex topics like human genome editing. I've seen communities in conflict-affected areas of southern Philippines working through how to improve livelihood programs after the pandemic. So people are not stupid. Given the right conditions, everyday people are more than capable of grappling with complex issues through systematic and informed deliberation. And finally, the key design feature of citizens' assemblies are the recommendations or joint statement that participants co-produce at the end of the process. So most assemblies at the moment don't have binding power, but they do expect a formal response from the commissioning body, whether that's the government or civil society. And again, we can debate here, should these assemblies have binding decision-making power? Should we judge their impact based on the extent to which they changed policy? Or maybe we can be more creative in assessing their impact in global governance, like shifting public discourse or building community capacity or creating new democratic habits. So we now have plenty of examples from the French Climate Convention to the Permanent Citizens Assembly in East Belgium. But one example that I often highlight is one from Lebanon, where in 2002, a citizens' assembly was conducted by civil society groups on energy justice. And despite political instability, they managed to convene a diverse group to deliberate on fair and sustainable energy futures. And what this example shows is that citizens' assemblies aren't just a global north phenomenon. They actually can be used in crisis contexts as well, such as the one that we have right now. So I'll put an end there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for both the kind of technical background, but also grounding it in, like, look, this is broadly applicable. It's not just in one context or scenario. I'd like to bring in now Caroline Vernon, Global Lead Advocacy and Campaigns at Democracy International, to draw on sort of items particular to implementation of the Global Citizens Assembly at the global scale, but also maybe there are some examples that you'd like to highlight there as well. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Tim for framing this in sort of the philosophical framework and the time that we are currently living on this planet, and Nicole for talking us through what it means to have a citizens' assembly. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to think about if we think about citizens' assemblies on the national level, I think we have an idea now of what that means, or on the local level, and it can seem a bit hard or daunting or even nearly impossible to scale all of this up to the global stage. There are some obvious challenges that we experience. So when we talk about citizens' assemblies, we talk about random selection, but we don't have a global population registry, right? We talk about representativeness of society, but humanity is so diverse and so varied that it's of course very difficult to represent to that justice, right? This diversity. So some trade-offs necessarily need to be made between representativeness in the statistical sense and the variety and diversity of humanity. We talk about informed deliberation based on facts, but this is, of course, difficult in multilingual contexts, as we all know. People have different cultural backgrounds, different cultural frameworks, different technical abilities, difference in access even to the internet, in access to travel due to inequitable visa regimes. And also just personally, I think this is also something that we can't forget. Taking part in a citizens' assembly as a citizen is also a major effort that you are bringing. It takes a lot of time to deliberate with other people and to come to a good compromise. So there needs to be good practices, that there are measures in place that compensate people for time that they have to take out of work, for childcare that they need to provide, and so on. And when we think about delivering recommendations on a global level, which is of course also a defining feature of citizens' assemblies, we run up against the challenge that there is no global government. Tim has mentioned that we can submit our recommendations to, knowing that they will be implemented. At the UN or in any multilateral institution, implementation and taking up of recommendations, of course, depends on the goodwill of states. And so there's a lot of difficulties there, but they are surmountable, and we've seen a couple of examples over the past years that really demonstrate that there are different ways that we can tackle all of these challenges. And I just want to talk us through two of those. So in 2021, we had the Global Assembly on Climate and the Ecological Crisis. Many people here were involved in that, and it may come up also later in the questions and in other comments. But it was 100 participants selected at random from all over the globe, not based obviously on population registry, but on population density, which is of course another way to look at it. They deliberated online for 12 weeks to avoid problems with traveling to a different location, and then to capture the difficulty of different technical skills and different access to the internet, or even having a computer or a phone. They had help. So there were organizations in place locally that assisted them to take part in the Citizens' Assembly, and to accompany them with translation, with internet access, and so on. They drafted a People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth, which they presented at COP26 in Glasgow. And it's a very nice declaration. I would recommend you all to read it. Because it really shows that despite differences in backgrounds and even initial attitudes towards climate change, which is something that these participants were asked about, and organizers really tried to get to also have climate skeptics as members of the assembly. It shows that people can actually come to a consensus and formulate a coherent plan of action together. Yes, and the second example I want to highlight, because it really stresses, or it comes at it from a different level, is the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was initiated by the European Union, that included 800 randomly selected citizens that met in person and online, and that deliberated basically in the 24 official languages of the EU. And also submitted their recommendations to the institutions of the EU. And these are just two examples that prove that in different ways that multilingual, transnational, diverse settings don't preclude meaningful deliberation. The diversity of humanity is not an obstacle to democracy and participation. If anything, it's a benefit. It's proof that we can agree on standards that matter to all humans, despite what contemporary politics might have you believe.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And as you say, democracy actually being what, diversity actually being what democracy stands on, like the diversity of thought itself. But you really contextualize that in a lot of practical context. So we've heard from Tim on the why, we heard from Nicole on the what, we heard from Caroline on the how. I'd like to now bring in Andreas Bummel, Executive Director of Democracy Without Borders, to contextualize this a little bit, Andreas, in a very practical kind of framework, could you bring this back to the United Nations for us and say, you know, in the context of the UN, the future, the kind of forward-looking aspect of things, how could global citizens assemblies really kind of support the future of multilateralism? Over to you, Andreas.
Well, thank you, Nudhara, and greetings to everyone. I'm very pleased that we are presenting this paper today after around a year of work. And on behalf of Democracy Without Borders, I would like to thank Democracy International for the excellent collaboration, and of course, Caroline, Nicole, and Tim personally for our joint work on the paper. And also a big thank you to the reviewers who provided very valuable feedback, and we will hear some of it later this afternoon. So let me briefly outline the key recommendations we have come up with as to how global citizens assemblies, or GCAs, can be implemented, particularly within the UN system, based on the principles we already heard of. First of all, we recommend the establishment of a permanent UN framework that allows UN bodies and entities, and there are many of them, to trigger individual global citizens assemblies on particular global topics on an ad hoc basis, if and when needed. This approach offers flexibility to have a wide range of topics addressed by GCAs, set up across different UN bodies and agencies, depending on their current priorities. At the same time, a central supporting structure would ensure common standards, synergies, coordination, quality control, and institutional learning across those ad hoc assemblies that we envision. This combination allows for responsiveness and efficiency while building credibility over time. From a procedural point of view, this framework can easily be created by the UN General Assembly by making use of the magic tool that some of you already know about, Article 22 of the UN Charter, which allows the General Assembly to set up subsidiary bodies as needed. This is a well-established and flexible legal mechanism. Hundreds of temporary and permanent bodies have actually, of very different nature, have actually been already created under this Article 22 of the UN Charter. Well, a permanent secretariat would manage the operations of this GCA framework under the UN, which includes citizen selection to coordination and reporting, and it would be an important body, the secretariat, to ensure consistency and upkeep and institutional memory over time. Each ad hoc assembly would function in an advisory role and provide evidence-based recommendations to the UN body or program it was triggered by, like the UN General Assembly itself or others. In the paper, we stress the need for these recommendations to be taken seriously. That's a key point. There should be formal obligations on the part of the commissioning bodies to respond and justify how inputs are used or why they are not used. Of course, there is no global government and decision-making system, a binding one at the UN, but nonetheless, we should not also underestimate the political momentum and international law relevance of UN decision-making and action. The creation of global citizens assemblies is complementary to other measures to strengthen global democracy. Ultimately, global citizens assemblies can and should exist alongside other democratic innovations we propose. They are mentioned also in the paper, such as the UN Parliamentary Assembly or the tool of the UN World Citizens Initiative. Actually, they can reinforce each other and together help close the legitimacy gap in global governance in important ways. This has already been indicated. We recognize in the paper that the international system in itself is troubled by deep-rooted dysfunctions, and it will require major changes. A constitutional moment has been mentioned, etc. We have that global citizens assemblies will contribute to this too. We are convinced of that. And the real challenge now is political will at the UN on the part of member states and the readiness on their part to invest into this venture, even under difficult circumstances. We know that the UN is facing an acute, immediate funding crisis, but bringing the voice of the people of the world to the table might actually be part of the solution. We hope our work provides a starting point that UN member states can take forward. Thank you very much. And back to you, Nudhara.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for that concise but packed intervention of various different recommendations. And again, I do encourage everyone to look through the report. We'll be sure to share the link in the chat box as well. You can also find it at democracyinternational.org or democracywithoutborders.org. So thank you to our co-authors for presenting the report to us, really contextualizing why, what, how, and moving forward specific recommendations as well. I'd now like to turn to what I think is the fun part of hearing some feedback, thoughts, comments from experts, people who are working in this space, who can really contextualize this report further in the current debates of today. In that vein, I'm delighted to first call upon Farsan Qasim from the University of Oxford. Farsan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nudhara, and to the presenters and conveners for the invitation. So first of all, I just wanted to say how happy I am to see the workshop today. For full transparency, I've worked with both Democracy Without Borders on the UN Parliamentary Assembly campaign, and also in recent years with ISWE on the Global Citizens Assembly. So I've worked with both of these organizations and sympathize with the projects. So it's very much sympathetic feedback that you've gotten from me and will get today. 3 points that I want to reiterate that you've already, the authors have read in my kind of provisional feedback, but that I want to reiterate today also for the larger audience that we have. So the 3 points are: one, relating to the composition of GCAs. Second point is about the root UN Charter Article 22. And the third point is about the relationship of GCAs to other institutions, the UN Parliamentary Assembly being one example. So to the first point, in the report, and in Nicole's and Caroline's presentations, especially just now, there's this emphasis on questioning the fundamental principle of random selection as the fundamental kind of composition principle of the GCA, and I'm very skeptical about that, and for the following reasons. So the main claim to legitimacy of GCAs is exactly random selection and therefore statistical representativeness of the underlying populations. So what such suggestions do, even though they're well-meaning, they go at the very heart of the project in terms of the composition principle, and therefore also at the main kind of claim to legitimacy that it has. And that has that brings different issues with it, right? So in the report, I saw you already incorporated some of the feedback that I gave there, or we gave there, but still, I think it is worth highlighting and thinking about what that implies if you actually chip away at this element of random selection, right? So to give you an example, I mean, in the arguments made for it in the literature, but also in the report that are picked up, there's always this underlying assumption that any deviation from it would be good, right? But what if, let's assume we have a GCA on the next mission of humans to Mars, right? It's very much a global issue. So you could have a GCA on it to deliberate on various aspects about it. But if you then want to allow for an adequate diversity in the voices represented, should you be overrepresenting flat earthers, so people who believe that the Earth is flat? Arguably, that's a group that has a very valid fringe point of view, minority point of view on the issue. If you approach that neutrally, right, you need to overrepresent arguably such a group. But then you would be spending a significant amount of time just debating whether Mars exists in the first place. So that's an example of how greater diversity and overrepresentation can go very wrong there, right? To talk about an issue that's closer to what we've seen, let's say Global Citizens Assembly on climate change. So what are the relevant groups there to be overrepresented? Is it Bangladeshi coastal residents? Is it sub-Saharan African farmers? Is it Pacific Islanders? And who is to determine whether the first, the second, or the third group is worth representing more? right? And who puts those who decide that in the position of power to do so? So there are important normative issues with it, unnecessarily raised, right? Raising additional normative considerations that aren't there in the first place if you go strictly after the ideal of random selection that would introduce. So the second and third point, and I'll keep them shorter because I wanted to labor this first point a bit more because I think it's so crucial. So the second and third, UN Charter Article 22 in the draft, still you put quite an emphasis on this, and I know where it's coming from. Obviously, it's been a long-standing, strategy of Democracy Without Borders or the UN Parliament campaign. I'm not so sure that for the GCA or even for the UN Parliamentary campaign, in a way, it's necessarily the preferred route, right? So if you take the big examples of really major reforms, and Andreas mentioned, that it's been used many times, but really the major institutional creations in recent years, the International Criminal Court being a case in point, were through a treaty outside of the UN, right? Or in the case of the GCA, ISWI's civil society-driven initiative has been a major initiative. So reconsider the emphasis there. And the final point is on the relationship to existing institutions. I think pre-specifying the position of GCAs and limiting it in certain ways, arguing that it shouldn't have legislative, executive, etc. power, is normatively difficult, is empirically unfounded, because sortition-based institutions have had these functions, and also it's unwise strategically because GCAs could serve as motors for other global governance reforms. So why limit them in function to what you have done to some extent in the draft? But still, very, very good work, and I'm very happy to see this kind of work being pushed by different organizations. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Farsan. I'd now like to bring in Matthias Koeng, who is with the London School of Economics. Matthias, over to you.
Hello, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and it was a great pleasure to read the report and to have the opportunity to reflect about it and also to feedback comments. I was especially thrilled to see that people whose work I have read and admired for several years came together to produce this report. And I think the result is really an extremely valuable discussion about the potential and the options and just the reason why we should be investing a lot of time in thinking about Global Citizen Assembly. And I also appreciate the fact that the document is really a reflection piece that doesn't sort of just point at easy solution. It highlights trade-offs, difficult choices to make, puts them in a very clear, on a very clear background of the drawbacks, strengths of different choices. So it's really something that advances the debate, and I think it will be widely. I think it needs to be widely read by policymakers, but also by people interested in global governance and making the world a better place. So I have kind of some reflections about one particular aspect, which I think is very important, and the report itself mentions, which is the potential of those citizen assembly to close the gap between elites and citizens when it comes to global governance. And of course, we all know that a lot of the authoritarian wave that we are seeing around the world and various worrying developments in terms of the political development of important countries, but across the world, has to do with rejection of elites and the declining legitimacy of traditional political systems. So I think the idea of bringing in citizens closer, not only at the local level or the national level, but also at the international level, is incredibly important in order to potentially reestablish the legitimacy of global cooperation and global collective action. So what, in a way, the paper also prompted me to consider is how this potential could be realized in practice, considering the risk that advocacy for this new kind of institutions could be itself somehow be politicized and seen as another elite project, another project of liberal elite. So what condition should there be to convince skeptics that are increasingly seeing discourses that deny the legitimacy of international action, of international cooperation, international organizations, that this is not simply another building block of creating some kind of global supranational authority that they disagree with, essentially. So there are two aspects that I will mention briefly that, from this perspective, seem to be particularly worthy of consideration. The first one is about the relationship between, the Citizens Assembly as a forum and what many people who support them also think about what the right solution to global problem is, the relationship between form and substance, if you like. So people who have invested a lot of time, I see many people represented in this meeting, invested a lot of time in thinking about this mode for democratizing global politics. I'm sure they also have ideas about how to solve global problems, what the fair, the just, the effective solution of things are. But you see, there is a little bit of a tension because, again, people who might need to be convinced about the democratic legitimacy of these assemblies might actually disagree with the substantive solutions advocated by the people. So you have this potential tension between, the same people who try to say, look, we are aiming for a democratic forum that listens to everybody. And at the same time, the same people might say, actually, not every solution is equally valuable. We have some ideas, and how to deal with this tension. I don't have a solution here, but also I think it requires some level of sort of almost restraint on the part of people, activists, and which emerges in a way in a number of forums. So the very fact how we present this forum. For instance, should you be using the word ecological crisis when we describe one of those initiatives, or is it already something that prejudges essentially the discussion? Another aspect, for instance, is, well, just to give an example from this wonderful report, at the beginning, in the introduction, there is a reference to the need to transfer state authorities from states to the global level. I could not agree more wholeheartedly, personally, but you see, if this is how initiatives are presented, then the risk is that it already alienates precisely those sectors of the population that might need more to be convinced to be involved and to see this as something valuable. So I'm presenting this as an issue without, unfortunately, being able to present some solution, but because it requires so much effort, attention, time, energy on the part of people that have to promote it. Is it also fair on activists to also expect a kind of self-denial? The second aspect is language. So I appreciate the report refers to...
And Matthias, I'm going to request if you could kindly wrap up for us as well.
Yes, the second aspect is language. And I appreciate the report refers to that various times. But I think this is another aspect where people around the world need to be convinced that this is a forum where they can contribute, fully, despite, maybe their linguistic limitations when it comes to speaking global languages. And I would say this is probably the most important aspect to consider when producing essentially evidence in favor of this Global Citizens Assembly.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Really appreciate those insights and thoughts to kind of provide different perspectives and context for this discussion. I'd now like to bring in Dowina Stratu from the Polytechnic University of Valencia. Dowina, over to you.
Hi, Nudhara. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Congrats for the policy brief. It was a pleasure to participate in all of that and also to have so good relationship and to work for the future with you, with Democracy Without Borders, with Democracy International. For me, is a big pleasure as a scholar, as an activist. I want to focus in one main questions, because I think it's one of the main doubts that we will have here about the institutionalization of Global Citizens Assembly, and why the UN, why to use the 22 article, why that? So for me, it's not longer if this is something that we need to do, but how, why, and how if it should be the time, because we have to do it very, very, very fast. I just want to say that right now I'm working, like, my research lines about the resilience of political system, and of course focusing on a democratic system as our main way of managing our political relationship. So why through formal public leadership? Why through an international level? Why starting with United Nations? Tim was saying before that we are creating a new international order, and we still don't have in the academy the words to measure that, to define it. But I think we have some forces or some idea how our political systems are evolving. And one of this is not longer about we selecting our representative who is having some power at national level. The Westphalian state is over. So now we have this multi-actor system where we have corporation, we have networks of power working in the international order. We have different forces, but we don't have people there. That is the reality of this. And also we can see it at a national level. We stop having people. People is not longer, they don't trust their institutions, and they have good reason for that. For in this context, for me, the assemblies are not longer an experiment. It's not longer if we should do it. It's a structural correction of the current system. It's an essential check and balance within this evolving system. So it's not also about the effectiveness of this. It has already been demonstrated. We were speaking here about the Conference of Future of Europe. It was an amazing experiment. We have Iceland with their new constitution also using a citizen assembly. It is working. What was the issue with the Conference of Future of Europe? It wasn't institutionalized as it is. It's not a real tool of the system. It's something that we create based on certain topics, but this is not the path to do it, because if we want to give the trust to our citizens to participate here, we have to make it as a tool of our as an arm of our system. So here I want, and also another failure of the Conference of the Future of Europe was that people were saying, we want more Europe, we want a new treaty. And until today, we don't have an answer, a formal answer of this recommendation of the people. So here I want to put on the table one of the recent study, a scientific study that I did with 41 European cases. My main questions was how citizen participation can achieve a systemic impact. And the answer that I had is that only if it's led and integrated by public institutions. And also one of the main issues here in this study was that in countries or international institutions, when the legitimation is very low, is when we can achieve that, because people will participate, will trust this. So why UN? Why Article 22? Because UN, we don't have legitimation as if we understand legitimation as the representativeness of the people. We don't have that. So in this kind of context, in this kind of international order, when there is a clear lack of legitimation, and maths are saying that this is the correct path to do it, then this kind of structure can't really help and can't really make something a structured change. So here, just to finish, my conclusion here is that this declining legitimacy that in the international sphere, where people, we don't have people represented there, we just have different powers, but not us. This is something strategic to open, to put it, and UN Article 22 can allow us to do that. So for me, it's not just an opportunity, it's how we can keep building our system to put one more piece. If not, unfortunately, the global governance and the systems, how we know them as like now, they can disappear, and this is something that we all know. So yeah, I wanted to give that insight. Institutionalization is key for all of this. For that reason, it should be an organ of the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darina, for underscoring that particular point and emphasizing it even further. We have two more experts who are going to jump in before we go into the Q&A portion. So I do want to encourage you to continue using the Q&A chat function. Not only will our authors kind of jump in and address things directly on the chat, but also we hope to bring a couple questions to them very shortly. But first, I'd like to bring on Antoine Varin from the Missions Publique to share some thoughts. Antoine, over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to be with you. Hope you can hear me well. I'm Antoine from the side of the practitioner, so doing citizens assemblies. And I would like to share two things with you, a good news and a warning. And the good news will be also a bit a contradiction from what my previous speaker was saying, because the good news for me is indeed the example of the European Union. We are going to have next weekend, the last session of the 10th European panel, and it's going to be on budget. So we are going to have European citizens giving their recommendations for the next multi-year framework budget of the European Union. And that's something, if you think about it, quite fantastic, because it's something that didn't exist before. And if you go back in time, and Caroline, you were talking about it, before that 10th panel, you had 6 that had been done by the European Commission, 4 that were part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And the Conference of Europe itself was a moment of change that was preceded. And that's, if you go back in time, 2018, you had the first pilot of a European citizens panel, and it was with 100 citizens. And it was kind of testing it. And after that came the Conference on the Future of Europe. And now every commissioner in their letter of mission, they have the mission to organize citizen participation. So the good news is that it's not impossible to scale. It's really possible, and it can go very quick. And that's, I think, the good news. But it starts always with an idea and with a kind of recipe. And that's why it's so fantastic to have that policy paper and many other papers that push for that idea. But I think that's very important, and that's a good news. So maybe in 2031, we can sit together and enjoy the 10th UN-led Global Citizens Assembly. And I hope we can celebrate that. I want also to share a warning, and the warning is that we shouldn't get stuck on one model. And that's a big, big risk that we have. And we have seen that in the past too. When you get stuck in one model, you get something like the consensus conference, the planning cell, the citizens jury, the 21st century town hall, and I can go on with the cemetery of methodologies that were supposed to be the one, and that was supposed to be the golden standard. And I think that all in all, the innovation and the moment we are in is too soon to have a purely standardized, completely done system. And so the warning is we need to, and that's all the more true at global level, because their governance is much more complicated and different also in nature than at other levels. So I think that the key is to consider that, for me, a centralized model hits a wall at global level. And we need to rethink the way we do impact, and that's what we were saying before. We need to rethink the way we organize the assemblies itself. And I say the assemblies because I think it needs to be more than one. It needs to be parallelized. It needs to be fractalized. And I saw that Jeremy you put a comment on fractal democracy, and I think that's the way at global level. You need to build with different bricks that come together. So that's the warning. Do not focus. Do not get stuck in one single model. And the good news is we already done it at European level, so it can be done also at global level.
Great. Thank you so much, Antoine, for that concise but impactful intervention. We really appreciate it. And as you said, yes, to be continued at the 10th Global Citizen Assembly. For our last expert, before we move into the Q&A portion, I'd like to bring in David Levi from ISWE Foundation. David, over to you.
Thank you, Nudhara. Can you hear me?
We can indeed, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you for the authors of the papers and the organizers for giving us the opportunity to have this this fascinating conversation, which is even more important today in the current context than it was before. And thank you for to the previous speakers who all made excellent points. So I'm not going to either reiterate. I'm sorry to come in late, but I would love to have like a full day workshop where we continue this conversation. So many points to tackle. But overall, this paper makes a clear and compelling case for integrating citizens' deliberation into the UN governance. And the main reason is being effective at fulfilling its mandate, fulfilling its mission. Indeed, it's clear that the UN can do a much better job, take better decision, overcome political deadlock if it integrates citizens' deliberation. I think the case was made clearly and nobody's debating that. So what's holding us back? Is the solution laying in a careful design or in a pathway of it for integration into a UN system which is struggling right now to remain effective and legitimate and adequate? I actually believe that I don't want to step into methodological discussions that I enjoy very much on the pathway to institutionalization, to look at the different options, because I unfortunately feel that this ship has sailed. And I don't mean to pour a negative tone as the last speaker, but I feel this is indeed a very political question that we're tackling here. And we had an example last year that most of you know very well, which was the Summit of the Future. It gave us a unique opportunity to hold overarching reflections on reforming global governance and making it more inclusive. At ISWE, where I work, we collaborated with many of you, with the Coalition of the UN We Need and many other allies, to put forward a lot of ideas, including the People's Pact for the Future, which a vision not only for a Global Citizens Assembly, but many other options to strengthen citizens' voices into global governance. And Andreas has talked about them. But in reality, none of these proposals have gathered almost any interest from member states. And the lead coordinator of these negotiations, the German ambassador, I know many of you were there as well, was very clear about it when she said that none of these reforms would make it into the final text because no country really wanted it. It was that simple. It's the political appetite in the UN to actually deliver that. So it didn't mean it was not the right thing to do, it was not going to happen, but it became clear that establishing a Global Citizens Assembly to support the work of the UN would not happen through some sort of a negotiated reform process. And that's why I'm a little bit skeptical on the institutionalization procedures that have been discussed by previous speakers. I think it confirmed the need to advance pragmatically and empirically demonstrate how such a body can be beneficial to global multilateralism. I think we understand it, but many actually don't. And so making the case is not going to be an intellectual case, it's going to be a demonstrative one. And if we cannot do it through the General Assembly, we might want to try another approach, and another approach that is about building a coalition of the willing that would be ready to endorse the Global Citizens Assembly as a legitimate voice of the peoples in order to demonstrate both its value, but also advocate for establishment, a more formal, a more permanent establishment, somewhat a stepwise approach. And I think the Brazilian government and many other institutions have understood this and felt, which is our case, that COP30 was offering a unique opportunity for this paradigm change. The Brazilian government wants to bridge beyond states and non-state actors to actually open space for real citizens. I say real citizens as proper agents of change that are willing to act on climate in an inclusive and equitable way, to build the resilience in their own community, and to find solutions that are acceptable to all, because that's the only way to move forward beyond political posturing or the polarization, and making sure their needs and concerns are heard in a way that where we can address the climate crisis. So this year, you all know that countries will be presenting new climate contribution, new NDCs, making commitments for up to 2040. And in a moment of such political volatility, it does matter to engage on a pathway for the next 15 years, knowing that it is a pathway, that there is popular appetite, that there is a political mandate to deliver this transition, which is incredibly difficult. And it's not just, dreaming plans. So it feels like without proper citizen deliberation, we're bound to continue arguing about climate plans, but water down our commitments with the risk of failing the collective goals. But with the Global Citizens Assembly, we can set up the infrastructure that engages millions in the transition that we need. And that's the purpose of what the Brazilians define their vision of a global mutirão, which is a collective effort that we're all engaging in all year long. So I'll just conclude by saying that the Global Citizen Assembly for COP30, that with others is coordinating, will begin its work imminently and will report back to the COP in June next year, so in about a year. Hopefully serving useful knowledge, but also serving many COPs and successive presidencies in order to improve climate multilateralism. And I sincerely believe that if the benefits of this governance innovation are visible, are noticeable through this, pragmatic, relative smaller step, it will make itself indispensable and will gradually be replicated through the UN system. And I really hope that's the way to institutionalize. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for that thoughtful feedback, and also showcasing some of the work that your organization is doing. I'd like to now bring back our panelists, because we've spent the better part of 20 minutes kind of picking apart your work, and so want to make sure that we give you a chance to respond. So Andreas, Nicole, Tim, and Caroline. We also have had some really thoughtful and interesting questions in the chat. So what I'll maybe do is share a couple of those questions, and then we'll go round the room, kind of 3 minutes for each of the panelists to either respond to a specific kind of point from the respondent, but also hopefully pick up some of the questions that we've had in the chat, if that sounds like a plan. So we've had a bucket of questions in the chat box that have spoken to, is the UN the right forum for this? Given the UN is essentially a collection of member state interests, how does the United Nations kind of provide that forum? Another sort of set of questions on both, what is the place for refugees here, especially given they are a result of the lack of democracy in parts of the world, and kind of combined with that, given the current trends we're seeing, that if anything are shrinking civic space, shrinking civic participation, realistically, how can we push for this even more ambitious call for participation? There's a third bucket of questions on kind of sovereignty and nation states. So in the context of, yes, there's the kind of individual pieces, but there's also the threads that combine us. It takes that extra step of understanding to be able to work at that kind of global citizenry level. And so beyond kind of citizen assembly at the local level, how do we reconcile or square that circle, or whatever metaphor you want to use there, of the nation state with this kind of grander politique idea, and any thoughts that you might have on that. I think there's also sort of very interesting pieces that have come from our respondents. So I'll go back to Tim I know that's a lot to capture, and as David said, we could be doing a full 3-4 day workshop on all of this. But if you could give us a teaser of some of the thoughts that we could dive into. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Nudhara, and thank you to all the experts who've contributed to this document. Lovely to see Prof. Matthias Koning, who I will be seeing next week. Very quickly on your questions you've posed, Nudhara, I think is the UN the right forum? In fact, we also did have our own extensive debate about this while we were putting this document together. And I mean, there are two sides to that argument. The one is that it's the premier it's the only universal organization that reaches a maximal number of countries that can actually help us to create space for GCAs moving forward. That's the one argument, and so we have to engage it in some shape or form. The second argument is that the UN, or the counter argument, sorry, I should say, is that the UN actually is beyond salvation where we stand right now. And in fact, the global citizen assemblies could be creating that embryonic basis for a new global constitutional order, as I mentioned before. Let me leave that there. Quickly on the issue of the shrinking civic space. I think it's precisely at times when the civic space is shrinking that we have to double down, accelerate, amplify efforts to create that space. And I think the case of South Africa is actually a very good example. When the apartheid regime was at its peak of its powers, is precisely when the people began to march and protest and challenge the existing political dispensation. And we can then transfer that domestic analogy to the global sphere. I think that is precisely the nature of the struggle we're in. And I heard Diona say this, we don't have time, we have to move very fast, and I completely concur with her, Doina, sorry. And then finally on, maybe I should leave it there so I don't hog the limelight, Nudhara.
Thank you so much, Tim. As you say, never waste a good crisis, right? That's kind of where we're at with this. Nicole, over to you.
Yes, I want to pick up the question about refugees and global citizens assemblies, because I think questions about precarious communities, communities that are often invisible and uncounted, not in population registers, are exactly the kinds of people who are at risk of being excluded from global assemblies precisely because we couldn't capture them based on official demographic records, right? And one of the projects that I'm thinking about at the moment is actually maybe we also need to reconceptualize what a global assembly looks like. Maybe it doesn't have to be 100 people in the same room together or in the same screen together. Maybe we can think about translocal as a unit of analysis of communities talking to each other that have a shared experience. So one can imagine a global citizens assemblies of refugees where you have people from Bangladesh talking to people from Syria, trying to chart pathways of collective action together that are directly involved through some form of sortition or random selection, but not necessarily through civil society representatives or through activist networks, right? So I suppose this ties into the question of, we shouldn't just be asking, is UN the right space for this? We should also be broadening our questions in terms of which other spaces can we claim when it comes to global governance for direct citizen participation outside institutionalized spaces.
Thank you, Nicole. Caroline.
Yes, and thank you very much for sharing that, Nicole. I think that's a super important question, and I just want to add to that refugees or people whose nationality or statehood is unsure, or stateless people, right? They are in fact excluded from all democratic tools that we have. So citizens' assemblies are their best way of or one of the best ways to actually try and actively include them. Yeah, I also wanted to comment a little bit on the question of the United Nations and the precise moment that we're living through. So we are at a time of unprecedented pressure on multilateralism. We're seeing funding pressures on international cooperation. We're seeing funding pressures on the United Nations itself. And I think what we're living through, if you look at it a little bit bigger, is sort of a backlash of the nation states to the multilateral system. But I think it is ultimately delusional. It is a complete negation of the actual world that we live in, which is complex and interconnected and global. And so we need a forum like the United Nations, and we need a forum that is democratic and that is not based on nation states alone, but that involves citizens at every level. The UN 75 report that Tim mentioned at the top of this webinar actually questioned 1.5 million people around the globe on what they think of the UN. And over 90% of people said that they think the UN does useful and valuable work and they need it. So I think the people of the world are agreed. The nation states are just not, hesitant to give away their power.
Thank you, Caroline. Can I actually ask you a follow-up on that quickly? So given there is this hesitation to give away power, and power is a big part of participation in democracy, how do you spoke to implementation earlier, but how do you kind of get past that, or how do you push past it in the context of implementing and institutionalizing something like this?
Yeah, so I think the coalition of the willing that David talked about is a very good place to start, right? So there are member states that believe in multilateralism and that believe in cooperation and that believe in making this a better place for everyone, right? I would say they're hopefully still even the majority of the member states. So I think a citizens assembly, but I think maybe this is also a good point to say the citizens assembly is one of many ideas that are out there, also one of many ideas that we work on, that Democracy Without Borders works on, that many of the people in this room work on. So they do one thing. They are very good at depolarizing debate, at making compromises, at bringing in voices that are not otherwise heard, right? And then it is up to those member states who are favorable to take that up and to push for that. And it can also be a help to them to actually prove that they have popular support and what is the common ground and what is the compromise that we can make, because citizens make, as was said, I think by everybody who spoke today, citizens are smart. Citizens know what is best for their future. It is just when we put power in the hands of people who can use that to their own benefit, they might not use it then for the benefit of the rest of us.
Thank you, Caroline. Andreas, over to you.
Well, I enjoyed very much this discussion, and indeed there are so many threads that require and deserve follow-up. That's not possible, obviously, at this moment, but I would want to draw attention to the fact that in this particular paper, and there are many efforts and papers and documents, but in this one that we've been presenting today, we are actually envisioning how we call it, an ecosystem of deliberation that includes various sorts of citizens' assemblies at all levels, and we've been focusing on the global level, and here particularly on the UN, and in express terms, we put it in the paper that, of course, the fact that we happen to focus on the UN in this particular paper, of course, does not mean that there are other efforts required, and in fact, they are ongoing, as we have heard, and that is, the train is moving. So what we have been trying to do is to paint a picture of how, if the political momentum comes up, and well, that is worth discussion, but if it happens, then we are trying to show how it could be done. In the meantime, this ecosystem of global citizens assemblies and global deliberation will simply move on, right? And I mean, I can foresee a situation in the future where the UN in itself, crumbles and loses significance. But, we will be able to say, look, the solutions have been around all along, and those in power, including, I am sad to say, democratic governments, they have not picked it up, and they were not willing to invest anything into it in terms of resources, political will, and whatever. So this is also a reference point for the future. There will come the time when there has to be UN reform or a new world organization. And then I hope these concepts will be picked up and they will actually be included institutionally in a new world organization. And just a final thought also, even at this moment, we have to be aware that the UN is not a monolithic organization. Sure, we have the core organization with the Secretariat, the General Assembly, the main bodies, but we have dozens of UN organizations and entities around that are doing important work, right? The development program, UNHCR, whatnot, and in the vein it's presented in our paper, there would be a framework that these entities all can draw on to trigger their own citizens' assemblies, right? And this, in my mind, that is not a centralized approach, apart from the fact that it would be, included in an ecosystem of civil society-led efforts, etc. But it is quite the contrary of it. It would be a platform that actually fosters decentralized use of citizens' assemblies, in this particular case, through UN entities. I think that's important to recognize.
Thank you, Andreas. I will say it's always so difficult to moderate these discussions because you have to refrain from just going on your own kind of thought process, especially when so many thought-provoking, interesting things are being said. But maybe to like very briefly abuse my platform here, is to just say I think, you know, the UN is whenever we measure things based on output and impact and not just the value of the process itself, we're often necessarily setting up organizations that are based on prevention for an uphill battle. So, you know, you think about what the role of the United Nations at its core is. It's a prevention-based organization. And so you don't see the pandemic that didn't happen, the war that didn't take place, you know, the economic collapse that didn't occur. You see the ones that did. And when you measure things based on like metrics of impact based on output, you're necessarily setting up the UN for failure whenever you try to think about whether it's been successful. And so I think paying closer attention to participation, to process, to, you know, the things that the UN is doing on a day-to-day, really helps you appreciate the value of the organization. Because again, what does the UN bring to the table? It brings the table, which is a really valuable thing in itself. I want to give everyone Tim, Caroline, Nicole, Andreas, 30 seconds, final thoughts, anything you would like to leave our audience with. Tim, over to you.
No, thank you so much. I think it's been great to have this conversation. I've had a sense of urgency coming from some quarters. I completely believe this is the window of opportunity that we have, given the chaos out there, is now, and it's the best time to mold new structures and engage especially policymakers, to get them on board to actually help drive this agenda. And some of them, in fact, are looking for such ideas. So let's keep pushing. And thank you so much to all the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Nicole.
Yeah, just inspired by what Andrea said, that the UN is not a monolithic institution. I also want to say that citizens' assemblies are not a monolithic democratic innovation. At its core, these are very dynamic, highly imaginative forms of citizen engagement. So I hope we keep the discussion going and continue imagining different ways in which we can democratize global governance.
Thank you, Nicole. Caroline.
I think that's actually a lovely note to end on, that our imagination as humanity is just, we should give ourselves more credit. We can build amazing things. And this is just one of many ideas. And if we can use our motivation and imagination for good, then we will all live in a better world.
Thank you, Caroline. Andreas.
Well, I wanted to primarily take this opportunity to thank you, Nudhara, for moderating this event. It's greatly appreciated, and everybody for participating also so greatly appreciated. Obviously, this is an ongoing discussion, and we are happy that we could make a little contribution to it. And well, back over to you, Nudhara. Thank you very much to all. Well, and final thing, we should not forget posting the link to the study and, of course, recommended reading.
Thank you, Andreas, for assigning us all homework at the end of this webinar. As I said, you can find the link to the paper as well at democracy-international.org and democracywithoutborders.org. Do also have a look at the other incredible work that they are doing in the space. I should also say Coalition for the UN We Need is an organization that is working towards bringing a lot of these new and innovative ideas from the citizenry, from experts to the fold, and trying to work with the UN to really push these ideas forward, especially on the road to implementing the Pact for the Future. Allow me to leave you with a final thought here. Global Citizens Assemblies, participatory democracy, is about reclaiming political power at the citizen level. At its core, that is more important now than it ever will be. In an era defined by transnational challenges, whether it be climate, pandemics, democratic crises, or conflict, top-down decision-making often falls short. So through GCAs, through other participatory mechanisms, we see a platform for democratic, inclusive, and deliberative discussion. And it's not just about inclusion for the sake of inclusion, but it's because as humanity, we only move forward when we find avenues to actively, productively process disagreement. And that is at the heart of our evolution of thought processes, of our institutions, of what's going to help us move forward beyond what we're currently at and build a better, more prosperous world. Thank you for your time this Thursday morning, evening, wherever you're joining us from, and do continue engaging in the conversation as we move forward. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.